You guys know James, yeah?
Yep.
Work with James. So I've been at Arrive for coming up on 7 years now. So I head up all of engineering. So that's software development, QA, and ops. I've been in the engineering field for 17 years now, doing software engineering. So worked for some large companies, some very small startups. Now we're Arrive, we're about 300 or so. So when I started, we were 23. So we're progressing into a much larger org. So we've had to do quite a bit of hiring, quite a bit of feeling out. What does that process look like? What should it be? What are we trying to get out of it? So the hope is that we kind of walk through what to expect there, kind of what we look for in hiring, and make this, in theory, useful. So if you have a question, please, I think there's like a raise hand feature or something, right? In Zoom? Yeah. So please ask questions. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. I've got some things that I'm going to run through, but they're nothing that has to, run in any sort of particular sequence. So don't hesitate to interrupt if you have something. Also, I apologize if it's noisy. My kids are upstairs, so hopefully they keep it down. All right. So from a hiring perspective, whenever we're looking to hire, we're effectively trying to assess 3 broad categories of things. One of them is problem-solving ability. How do you approach a problem? What sort of questions do you ask? How do you break problems down? How do you choose solutions? How do you iterate over solutions? Are they novel? Are they run-of-the-mill? How do you adapt? Like just the general, how do you go about solving a problem and implementing a solution? Second of those things being technical proficiency. So how skilled are you with your chosen tools and technologies? As you build solutions, are they readable? Can another developer work in them? Are they a massive code that no one will ever be able to inherit? And then as you go to solution, are you creating reasonably well-organized, thoughtful solutions, or are you just throwing stuff up at the wall and hoping something sticks at the end of the day? The last thing is teamwork and personality. And so how do you communicate? How do you interact with the person you're interviewing with? How do you communicate with them? Do you take initiative? Do you receive feedback if feedback is offered? Do you ask for feedback if you get stuck? Really sussing out, are you someone we want to work with? Are you someone that we think we can put into the dynamic of our engineering organization or of a particular team who's going to be successful on that team? And so everything we do, the problems we ask you to solve, the way we structure those interviews is trying to touch on all 3 of those key elements within that interview. So each of our interviewers walking out of that have a decent idea of how do you line up in those columns. And then as a group, we can come together and figure out, like, is this a good fit or is it not? So all of that is generally boiled down to some technical questions, which is not an amazing way to do it, but what the industry has chosen to do for the most part. So preparing for those questions is important. So there's plenty of resources you can use. Cracking the Coding Interview is a bit of an older book, but it's actually a really good book in that it works through kind of pattern matching and analysis of how questions map back to concepts and ideas, and then getting you used to just solving those ideas. Project Euler will do the same thing. If you're interviewing for a particular a role, especially like early in your career and you're targeting like React roles or Rails roles or Java Spring roles or anything like that, you can literally Google interview questions for that role. If it's a small company, the likelihood they have a bank of questions is low. It's probably just some things the engineers came up with. They might be Googling the same thing. Larger companies generally have a bank of questions they'll operate out of, but a big part of this is just getting used to seeing a question, identifying approaches to a solution, and then working through the implementation of that solution. Sure, finish it. All right. So when it comes to technical interviews, you're usually going to get a phone screen. The purpose of the phone screen is to ascertain, is this someone we want to bring on site? So bringing someone on site takes time away from engineers. It's a reasonable investment of time on both sides. So we want to make sure that the people we bring on site are people we feel good about. Generally, the phone screens are that first level screen. They're constrained for time. They're kind of your baseline filter. We do them with an engineer. Some companies do them with a recruiter. I don't love that because giving a recruiter a list of questions and acceptable answers isn't great. Doing it with an engineer gets you a bit more nuanced analysis of how did this actually go. But that's generally your first touch point is going to be your phone screen. Following that, you're going to get either on-site, which at this point, probably not on-site, like it's probably going to be remote over some screen share. And it's either going to be pair programming, solo programming, or some take-home challenge. I'm not a giant fan of take-home challenges because given enough time, anyone can Google enough to build anything. Historically, we haven't gotten a lot out of it. We stopped doing it several years ago, but there are companies who will give you a sample project and say, take no more than 4 hours and do X, Y, Z. At that point, they're assessing how do you build your solution? How do you write your code? Is it clear? Is it well structured? Are there reasonable comments? Things like that. For the pair programming, solo programming, again, the goal here is to assess your skills. But I think the one thing that people often forget is we're also really looking to assess communication. A gigantic part of your job is going to be working with your team and communicating with them. So things like, how do you clarify a problem domain? How do you clarify requirements? What sorts of questions do you ask? Like those are important in that setting as well. The least useful interviews that we do are the ones that people just bury their head and just type. It doesn't let me really assess any of the other things other than can this guy write code? And a lot of people can write code, but it's not great if you write code and have a very abrasive personality and you're moving on to a team of people who constantly interact with each other. And that's just not a good fit. So communicating is critical at this stage as well with the person you're interviewing with. Now, they should be a good interviewer and they should be prompting you. They should be talking to you. They should be trying to get at what are you thinking? How are you approaching this problem? Like the interviewer is a part of that process, but many times your interviewer is not going to be awesome at interviewing either, right? Most of the time it's just engineers on the team. They're like, hey, we need somebody to do an interview. Larger companies are better at this process sometimes, but not always. And if you get a bad interviewer, that's rough. Like you've got to kind of try to make the best of it. So when you think about technical questions, sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that. There's stomping and yelling. When you think about technical questions, generally these technical questions are going to fall into a few categories, right? Sometimes you just get questions that are ridiculously complex and difficult because the interviewers don't know what they're doing. There's not a lot you're going to do about those. Hopefully you don't get them. They're ridiculous. Fortunately, trick questions have kind of fallen out of favor. The whole, oh, what would you do if you're in a blender and you got shrunk to the size of an ant and it's going to turn on in 30 seconds? And you're supposed to know that, oh, strength doesn't scale proportionally with size, and I jump out, right? Those were super popular. They've fallen by the wayside, thankfully, because they're useless. And so you might get them. Another set of questions are just kind of rote algorithmic questions. Yeah. Do you see that this is a depth first search or a breadth first search or a binary search, or just simple, you either know the algorithm or you don't? At that point, it's helpful to know it. It's helpful to be able to analyze the problem and be like, oh, this is a DFS search, no problem. Here we go, work through it. I don't love these problems because as someone who's interviewing, it doesn't really tell me much. You either know it or you don't. If you know it, it doesn't tell me anything about your ability to come in and solve problems and be successful. And if you don't know it, it doesn't necessarily tell me anything about that either. So you should be aware of them, going through some of those exercises or those books will start to expose you to those concepts and what those problems look like. But that's kind of the first pattern matching bit. The other two sets of questions, which we've seen most often that I actually like to use quite a bit with our team, are questions that seem really challenging, but actually aren't that hard. And questions that seem really easy, but have a lot of nuanced complexity. So we asked a question, for example, years ago, where, if you wanted to build an alarm clock display, just a digital display, block, 4 blocks, how would you do that? And then we say, okay, well, now let's take an integer and scale the numbers. And it sounds really simple at first, but they don't scale vertically and horizontally the same. And so it gets you to a solution, and then you have to start to go back and rethink some of the assumptions you made about your problem. How do you draw the numbers? How do you model the numbers? And it lets you work through some of that. So it sounds really easy, but it actually ends up being a reasonably complex solution if you start with a really simple base. Similarly, they're very challenging. Like you look at it on its face, and you're like, oh, this seems impossible. Years ago, we were going through the acquisition process with Google, and we had interviewed. And they asked this question. And at the time, it was like, oh man, but now I really love this question. And it was, given a hallway of any size, infinite size, and a list of motion detectors with point radius, find if there's a path through the hall. You're like, well, how big is it? Well, it's infinite. It could be any size, right? You're like, well, this seems really, really hard. And if you try to prove true, it's really, really hard. But if you just prove false, it's actually really trivial to solve. And the entire goal of that is to get you to step back and think about, okay, what am I proving here? How can I prove this? How do I ask some questions and break the problem down and arrive at an efficient and effective solution? And the reason I like that question is, if you don't do it, if you just see the problem and hyper focus and dive straight in, you're in for a really bad time. You're going to write pages and pages and pages of code. It's never going to arrive at a reasonable solution. And so as you're interviewing, like, this is one of the things that trips most people up, where they get caught and they can't see the forest for the trees. They get a problem, they immediately hone in on, wow, this is hard, or wow, this is easy, and boom, pen to paper. And it's important to step back, articulate the problem, articulate what you believe the problem domain to be. This is what it is, this is what it isn't. These are the requirements. These are my assumptions. These valid assumptions. As an interviewer, that's my chance to go, oh, hey, we're headed down the wrong path here. No. You misunderstood. Here's what I meant, right? Or no, we actually can't make that assumption, so we have to handle that. If you don't communicate any of that at the onset, and you just start writing code, you start blazing through a solution, you might be 15, 20, 30 minutes in before we realize this thing is going nowhere. At which point it becomes challenging to pivot and move past that. And so doing that early and communicating effectively to the interviewer, one, sets you up for success, but also helps demonstrate to them, how do you communicate? How do you solve this problem? How do you think about building that solution? If there are multiple ways you could do it, talk about it. Like the number of times people have got caught up trying to think of the most clever, the most efficient solution and wasted 15, 20 minutes of a technical interview. And the reality is, if your technical interview is an hour, I want to leave you 10 to 15 minutes to ask questions. The first 5 minutes, we're going to be chatting a little bit. And so you've probably got 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes to really build out a solution. So if you're going to stand and waste 15 minutes trying to come up with the most novel, clever solution, you're doing yourself a disservice. It's much better in those instances to communicate, like, hey, there's a brute force way or a way we could solve this that's not the most efficient. We can do that immediately, and we can double back to performance. And if I really care about finding the performance solution, that's my chance as the interviewer to go, yep, acknowledge, let's talk about that performance one first though. That almost never happens though. I want you to get something down. I want you to get something working. Because then we can talk about, okay, how would we double back and address some of these efficiency issues, right? Like, hey, you're running 3 nested loops. We definitely don't want to do that. You've acknowledged you don't want to do it. We're on the same page. Let's talk about it, right? And those technical discussions, again, just lend more weight into how do you communicate? How do you problem solve? How do you think about iterating through your solutions? And so communicating that early rather than just diving in and either whiteboarding or typing out a bunch of code is helpful to set everybody else up in this interview process to be successful. Both the interviewer, so they can get the information that they need, and you to be able to effectively display, here are the ways that I can approach this, here are the skills I have, here's how I'm someone you want to invest in, right? So the reality is you guys are all early in your career, right? And so when we hire people early on in their career, and I would say early is like, 3 years or less, like we're looking for how do we find people that we can give more meaningful work. We can start to ramp them up on complicated things, architecting their own solutions, and facilitate accelerating their growth curve. So we're looking for that potential. We're looking for, hey, you don't have a lot of experience writing code, but man, you do a great job breaking down problems into solvable blocks and devising solutions for those things. I don't care that you haven't done that for 10 years. Like, that's a really valuable skill and something that not everyone is great at. A big part of that, though, is you've got to communicate that to the person who's interviewing you, who may or may not be great at extracting that information. Hopefully they are, but oftentimes they're not. They're just an engineer who got called in to do an interview and is trying to figure their way through it as well. So I think the one thing that I would say to consider as you write code is the solution is not the end. We've hired people who didn't get to a solution to one or more of the questions we asked. And we've also not hired plenty of people that blazed through and got the solutions. So the entire process of solving that problem, of building out your technical solution, that's the evaluation. If we had a great discussion about how are we going to break this down and what sort of requirements do we have and what assumptions can we make, and you've clearly articulated, this is how I'm going to solve this, and we just ran out of time writing code, I could not care less in this instance. Like, I know exactly where you were going. I know the solution you've devised. This was a time constraint thing in a time boxed event. I have all the information I need. And so we've had people walk away from interviews just dejected that they didn't finish their solution. But if you've given me a clear picture of where you were going, this is far less relevant. In the same vein, though, if you don't give me any idea of where you were going and you don't finish, I have no idea what we were doing necessarily. And so like that's where, as the person interviewing you, I don't really have enough information to say thumbs up, we should definitely hire this person. And your goal walking out of the interview should be, they're like, yeah, we want to hire this person for sure. So it's a bit on you to communicate that and make sure that you're getting all that information across on, here's how I stack up as a candidate. Here are all the things I bring to the table, whether that interviewer is drawing it out or not. All right. So the last interview we do a work history interview. This is pretty common. It sounds weird. Like, why would we do a work history interview? Like, we have your resume. The reason we do it is we're looking for a few specific things. Again, our hiring, we want to bias towards people we can invest in who are going to grow. And so whether you've had one job, 10 jobs, if you have 10 jobs and you stay somewhere 6 months every time, it doesn't look great. But we want to go through that history and ascertain, for each of your positions, do you have a history of demonstrated success? Are you successful in what you do? What made you successful there? Are you taking initiative and driving your own success? Are you just like a cog in the machine, like waiting for someone to give you something? Are you identifying areas for improvement? Are you advocating for those positive things? And that's something that this applies across industries. This applies in positions that weren't necessarily strictly software engineering positions. This applies to internship positions. Like we use this with things kids do in college who are just new graduates, because it gives them the opportunity to demonstrate, hey, this is me, this is what I do. We're looking for growth and introspection over time. How do you change over time? As a software developer, it's amazing. You always look back, like every year, every 2 years, you're looking at old code you wrote, like, my God, this is terrible, right? But this is growth. Like you grow over time, you learn over time, patterns change, you get better. And so we talk about what are the things that you're proud of that you did? Like if you did that time again, what's something you do differently? And what we're trying to get at there is you've grown throughout your career. You've matured as a human. You've learned as a developer, or you've grown your technical skills. And so if you take where you are now and look back where you were, would you do the same thing again, or would you do something differently? That spawns a lot of good discussions. There are some people who would do nothing differently ever, which is an interesting take, but it's one that makes you start to question, like, are you introspective? Are you looking at what you're doing? Are you analyzing, how do I improve and how do I grow over time? And the last thing we're looking for is what keeps you engaged in a position and what are you looking for? So again, we don't want to hire people and cycle them out every 6 months. I don't think anyone does. Hiring is challenging. Hiring takes a lot of time. Hiring costs a lot of money. You want to hire the right people and invest in making those people successful. And so as someone who's interviewing, I want to understand, what do you enjoy about the jobs that you had? What were you really proud of that you did? What were you highly engaged in? Why are you leaving companies? Like, what makes you leave? Is it a lack of opportunity over time? Do you get bored with things you're working with? Is there, did you move 5 times? What's causing you to leave companies? And what are you looking for in your next role? Do we offer that, right? One of the big things that I think is important is, as you do technical interviews, the interviewer is trying to assess, is this person right for this role? Are they right for this role at this company? Are they right for this role on this team within this company? It's also on you to get all the information to assess, is this the place I want to be? Given what I want to do, is this the right fit for me? And I think that's where, to me, it's often quite clear when we're in interviews and we're getting honest answers that people are passionate about. Like, these are the things I enjoy. These are the things I like doing at work. Versus I read the job description. This is what it says. These are the things I love to do, right? When people are actually engaged in things they're doing, they talk about it. And I would encourage you to be very honest in those situations. We've done interviews with people who've just applied for the wrong position. And as we talk to them, it's like, oh, you don't want to do this. You want to do data science. Like, you are passionate about data science. You would be a great candidate for this role. You just applied for the wrong role. Maybe you didn't know the data science role was out there, right? You threw a resume out for an engineering position. And it's through those discussions that we can start to figure out, is there a really good fit here? Because again, our goal is to bring people in and grow them. I would suspect that your goal as someone who's interviewing is to find a company that's going to support your growth and go execute, become better at your job, grow in your skills, and then build a career out of that. And so I think that's a time that is important for you to ask questions and ask questions that are meaningful to you. So we always leave time at the end of technical interviews, or we try. It doesn't always work out because some people are hyper focused on completing a solution. But I always like to leave that time because I want to give you a chance to ask meaningful questions. It's somewhat of a bit of a yellow flag when we get to the questions portion. It's like, you have one question about how we work, team composition, company, what you'd be doing, engineering philosophy, a single question. Like, you should have some questions, because opinion of one here, you should care where you're going to work a little bit, right? Like, if this is somewhere you really want to be and be invested in, like, you're going to want to know something about it. And so that's where, have that questions, understand the things that you care about or you think you care about, and ask. I have had some weird questions asked. I've never had someone ask a question that we were like, well, we can't hire this person now. They asked this question. Everyone cares about different things. And so you should be asking about the things that are important to you. If tool chains are important to you, ask about it. If PTO is important to you, ask about it, right? Like, this is a personalized thing. We had a guy ask, he loved music. And, he said, well, maybe 6 months, a year in, he's like, I might want to pursue music. Is it possible I could go down to 4 days a week and keep that day for my professional music career? I was like, we can talk about that if you want down the road. Like, let's be honest, it's going to be 80% time for 80% pay, not 100% pay. But if that's something that's really important to you, let's talk about it. We hired that guy. So that was a weird question. I'd never heard that before, but he was a strong engineer. And so, like, hey, people have different hobbies and different lives. And that was really important to him. So everybody probably doesn't have questions along that vein, but have something meaningful that you actually care about, because this is your opportunity to get it from the engineering team, right? And James is on now. Like, James will give you recruiter answers. Like, James has got his stuff. He's like the company hype man, right? Great job.
Thanks.
When you are asking engineers in technical interviews questions about their team, questions about how they work, the things that you care about, like, they should be giving you real answers. Like, if you're just getting a bunch of drone copy paste answers, hey, this is something that you should consider. If you're talking to people and you've got several highly engaged people who are really passionate about what they're doing, hey, this is another data point to take into consideration, right? Like, you're ultimately trying to find out, is this somewhere I want to be? That's a great time to talk with the people who sit there every day and work in that environment and suss out how do they feel about that as well. All right, so I think that's most of what I had put together. Any questions? I'll answer anything.
I know this is more about technical questions as far as interviews go, but you'd mentioned earlier why did you leave previous jobs, or what did you enjoy about them? 2 questions about that. One, is there a bad answer to that? And 2, I'm completely leaving the field that I was in. I'm totally new to tech, specifically because I did not enjoy what I was doing previously, and it was really easy for me to get bored. And then I would take on a ton of stuff just to not be bored, and then I would burn myself out. Is there a way to say that without that being a red flag?
Yeah, that's the way to say it. I think the thing to follow it with is, here's why I'm passionate about technology, and here's how technology has helped me solve this problem, right? The reality is, I think most people in engineering are the same way. If you don't give them a steady supply of interesting problems and do things to work on, interesting things to work on, they get bored and they go somewhere else. Like, this is kind of how people work, right? Most people are curious. Most people want to learn. Most people want to grow. We're fortunate in our industry that we've had, I've been here 7 years, and the business has continued to evolve and change, and the problems we have to solve continue to evolve and change. And so our teams get to do more and more and more, and there's no end to that in sight. But that's not unique in the engineering field. And so I think articulating, here's where I was, here's what I didn't like, right? And the fact that you are taking on more things to try and fill that void and burning yourself out. So this is not a negative to me. Like, I want to hire somebody that goes, yeah, I'm bored. Let me find something new. Let me find something interesting. Like, that's something that we would look to channel toward productive things. Like, one, don't burn out. Like, there's a line. It's got to find that line. But that's the initiative. Like, those are the traits that we're looking for. Articulating, here's how I think this career change helps me solve that is kind of the follow-up there that would kind of tie that out. Is there a bad answer? So generally, as we're going through that list, we're not looking at one position or two positions, right? Like, we're talking through, why are you leaving various jobs? At some point, you might get a bad organization or a bad manager, and that's why you leave. That's okay. If you've had 6 jobs and every job you're at, you've had a bad manager, I mean, we start to look at the odds, right? We interviewed a guy who was a strong engineer who had been fired from his last 4 jobs. And I asked him, like, why do you think this keeps happening? And his answer, just deadpan, was that he felt like he had a very punchable face. I was like, all right, so this gentleman, not particularly introspective, has clearly been fired from his last 4 positions. Like, for me, that's a red flag, right? Like, that's probably not a guy we want to bring into our team. But the reality is, most people have a combination of reasons for leaving. If you have a history in engineering, every position you're at, you get bored and look for a new challenge, that's not a red flag for me. That's okay, can I put this person in a position where we're going to be able to continue to challenge them and keep them engaged? Because I've got to understand, as someone who's hiring, like, this is someone else I've got to keep engaged. You would slot in right alongside the other 20 people I have to keep engaged, right? Like, this is just a thing. But I think that's an area, to be honest. Like, there are roles that you're going to go in that, hey, you're writing wrappers for existing APIs. Good luck, right? Like, if you're somebody who needs that constant progression and challenge, you're going to get bored in that pretty quickly. And so the question you should be asking is, are there other opportunities here at this organization? Other ways that I could find something that challenged me or kept me engaged? Similarly, if you know that about yourself, I would try to assess from the people who are interviewing you, like, what do they ask their engineers to do? There are companies where engineering is the last man on the totem pole, and engineers just get pre-cut stories, and it's like, here you go, here's the input, execute it, make the output. Boom, 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 and it's just a machine. We don't work that way. I don't think you attract and keep good people that way. So our engineers are a part of that solutioning and design process. So you would probably want to feel that out about the company you're going to, because my suspicion is, if you got bored previously, being in a job where someone just constantly hands you a story and it says, given A, B, C, do X, Y, Z, that turn it in, get the next one. Probably not compelling for a particularly long time either.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. Anything else?
If there's just a single question, I'll be blown away. This is Josh, usually you spend about a half an hour answering questions. Come on, folks. What do you got?
I have a question regarding technical interviews. So I know some companies, like you mentioned, different companies do it different ways. I've heard that there's some companies that don't even do technical interviews. In your opinion, is that a red flag from an applicant's perspective, because maybe they're not screening out people who are not writing good code or have other issues?
So this is a wonderful topic with lots of debate. If you've ever gone on the internet and looked up like people's opinions on technical interviews, it's all over the place. So the technical interview is challenging because it doesn't really tell me how well does this person write code? How well do they write tests? How comprehensive are the tests that they write? How adaptable are their solutions over time? Like, it doesn't tell me a lot of things about this person. And I think this is one of the things that people who don't like technical interviews point to. And there is the truth that some people get really, really nervous in technical interviews and do not perform to their capability. And people who are gainfully employed and doing well at their job show up for a technical interview and just, they're so nervous, their hands shake the whole time, right? Those people, you're going to walk out of that technical interview and it's not going to be a great impression. That doesn't mean they're not good at their job, right? It just means in this interview setting, they're not fantastic. So it would not be a red flag for me. I'd be interested in what they're interviewing for. We've kind of honed the characteristics we're looking for over time: problem solving ability, general technical proficiency, and communication. How do you work? Because we believe, like, hey, if you tick these boxes, we can slot you in and you can be successful. I can teach anyone syntax, right? We can teach people good paradigms for how to write tests and how to write code and how to write clean code. We've got a good process that supports that. All code goes through code review, right? Like, even if people come in with bad habits, we can write that ship pretty quickly. I would be interested to understand as an applicant, like, how are you assessing candidates if you're not doing technical interviews? And then post-hire, how are you evaluating those hires? Because either one of two things is probably going to be true. Either they've got a window after the hire in which you have to prove your merit or you're out, or they're going to hold on to people way longer than they should, right? Like, they're going to be either probably quick to hire or it's going to drag out. And both of those come with potential negatives, right? If you're dead confident in your ability, who cares if there's a 6-month review, right? Go in, kill it, no problems. But if you're being asked to step into a role where you've got to ramp up on a new language, new technologies, like, that might be important. And how then are you going to be evaluated at the end of that period? Similarly, if they're hiring people and not doing a technical vetting and they're holding on to them for a long time, like, I'm not a big believer of, we've got 80 people and 35 standards, right? And so with that, you've got to find the right people, and you've got to, admit when it's not a good fit if you don't have the right people. And so you ideally want to step onto high functioning teams that are full of people that work well together in solid technical stacks. But those teams are comprised of 30% of people who, they're probably going to let go in like a year. That's tough. That's a tough environment to walk into. And so the big question would be, if you're not doing technical interviews are admittedly flawed. What are you assessing? How are you assessing candidates? What are you looking for? And I would honestly ask them that in the interview process, right? Like, just what are you looking for when you assess people? And if they don't want to tell you, like, interviewing is not some magic secret thing. Like, they're super secretive about it. All right, here's another data point on your side to consider, right?
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So going to the people who do get super nervous, or people, like, some of us are definitely disabled veterans and stuff. And so we may have, high anxiety, mental health, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and technical interviews can definitely spark that off for people. Could you let your interviewers know that you suffer from that without, breaking the rules of talking about mental health and stuff like that? Because the idea of just, avoiding technical interviews just doesn't seem feasible. So can you be vulnerable with your interviewees with that type of stuff?
Does James want to give an HR answer?
Yeah, I will. So the HR answer, I think, just general, the general answer should be, you can be as forthcoming as you want, right, in regards to what your expectations are and what you kind of need to be successful. organizations need to respect that, right? That is something that is, we are legally required to do, offer reasonable accommodations, right, in regards to someone's ability to perform in a job function. So I think it is more than reasonable to say, you know, I do often need a little additional support to either get comfortable or whatever it is. You know, give me a little bit of time to warm up in order to truly be, you know, evaluated. So you can offer information. I think it's beneficial. Again, it could show could show the colors in regards to the organization, right, and who they are, and what kind of employer they be. But you don't have to overshare.
As an interviewer, I would love that information, right? And I'll tell you why. The answer is twofold. One, if we reach a point where it, like, let's say you get stressed very easily, right? This is a good cue to me that I should work to help de-escalate, that I should put in a little extra effort to make sure you feel comfortable and supported in that process. Two, it's probably going to change how we interview a little bit, right? So if our technical interview is slated for 45 minutes, we're going to get through 1 or 2 questions, probably. And so how I structure those questions and what I offer you is 100% up in the air. And there are times where during our initial conversation at the start of that interview, it's like, oh, you talked about this, let's poke at that a little bit. And so if I know someone is prone to anxiety or prone to be very nervous, I can make my first question a softball, like really tee it up there and let you build some confidence so that when we get into something more challenging and more meaningful, you're feeling better about the process. You're feeling better about how you're doing, and we can have a more meaningful discussion in that. And so knowing that information lets me then try to make that a more successful outcome. So assuming you can share, I would encourage you to, in whatever way you feel comfortable, bring that information forward, because the reality is everyone we ask to do anything needs some support. Different people need varying levels of support. And so even when we ask our more junior engineers to step up to the plate, like, hey, build an end-to-end solution and present it, we've got to put in guide rails. Like, we've got to make sure that they have room to fail, but will fail successfully. So their failure is not catastrophic, but we give them the room to learn. And so even in the working environment, outside of the interview environment, everyone needs different touch points. There are people who they thrive with that daily check-in. Hey, where are you at? How you doing? You need any help? And there are people who that will drive mad. And so as someone with a team of engineers, like, I need to know that about individual people who are working for me. I need to make sure they're getting the right amount of touch points from their manager to put them in a situation to be successful. So it's helpful in the interview. It's also helpful post-interview.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else? No? It's better at home because I can drink. I don't end up all parched at the end.
What do you do in the event that, like, I tend to sometimes when someone asks me a technical question, I'll just feel like a lot of people, they just get kind of blank a little bit, or if you're like completely lost, what do you recommend doing in that situation? Do you ever say like, yeah, I'm completely lost, or like, is that bad practice? What do you do? I don't know if it's worse to be honest or.
No, the worst is when you stand there for 10 minutes saying nothing and doing nothing. And as the interviewer, I'm like, what is this person thinking, right? So as the interviewer, in this instance, I'm over there, like, what are you thinking, right? Talk me through where you're at, right? And what I want to ascertain is where are you in the solutioning process so that I can throw some bones, right? Here you go. Have you thought about this? What about this? Almost always, when I'm asking questions, it's for a reason, right? It's shaping where we're going or shaping the discussion. As someone who's interviewing, I would articulate, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm stuck, right? Let's say it's the beginning of the problem, right? You asked me to do this. Here's how I understand the problem, right? I'm trying to think through the right approach. I'm not sure where to start right now. That's fine. You've clarified the problem to me, right? So then as the interviewer, maybe I'll throw some assumptions out. Like, well, do we have to worry about this? Do we have to worry about this, right? Trying to kickstart that process for you. Help fill in some of the blanks to get you started. Similarly, if you're in the middle and you get stuck, just explaining, here's where I'm going. Here's where I think we want to be. I'm stuck at this part, right? That lets me then go, okay, where he's going is the right way. How do I help him get unstuck here? Or, where we're going is the wrong way, right? Let's double back and talk about how can we think about this maybe in a different way, or how can we approach this solution? That's part of that back and forth communication. The reality is at work, this is what we're going to do, right? No one's going to throw you on an island and be like, see you in a week, figure it out, right? So not communicating makes that really, really hard. I would encourage you to be honest. Don't, and I had this happen. This was brutal. We had a guy who, he had a master's in computer science. I don't know what his undergrad was in, but he was trying to effectively search an array of items. And he was just doing a linear search. And we got a solution done. It was like, okay, like this linear search though, it's not great, right? How can we do this better? There are many ways to do this better, right? And he's like, I don't know. Okay, like let's talk about it though. He's like, yeah, but there's only like 10,000 items, so we don't have to worry about it. Like, all right, there's 1 billion items now. What do you want to do? And it was 20 minutes of him just going, I don't know. Okay, right. I'm trying to talk through it, let's not even think about writing code. Like conceptually, what are more efficient ways we could look through this data just at a concept level? And he did not engage in the discussion. Like he just threw his hands up and was done. We did not hire that gentleman. But like that's where as an interviewer, like I get it. Like it's easy to, especially once you start down the road of a solution, it's easy to get tunnel vision on that solution. So sometimes it's hard to pivot and it's hard to think of new concepts. And if you get stuck, it's hard to circle back and think about, okay, how did I get here? How could I do this differently? So if you're communicating those things to me, it's my job to help stimulate that process, right? But I would definitely encourage you to communicate it with the context. Here's where I'm at. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I know or what I think I know. Here's where I'm stuck. Because the other thing might be what you think you know is a wrong assumption. And so with any given solution, you're making assumptions. And some of your assumptions may complicate your solution dramatically, and some may simplify. And so you may have interpreted the problem and thought, man, I've got to do X, Y, Z. And then like, wow, this is really hard. I don't even know how to get at these things. Whereas if you say like, hey, here's what I'm trying to do, here are the assumptions I'm making, and here's where I'm having a hard time figuring it out to start, that gives me a chance to go, we don't even have to care about X and Y. Throw them aside, Z only, because that's a much simpler solution, and that's really what we were getting at. So long story short, communicate it with context. I think that gives everybody the best chance to get the most out of that interview.
I have a follow-up. I noticed that just doing like practice with other students in the cohort where I was like pretending to be the interviewer, I always felt like I was kind of rooting for them to like get to the right answer. And I was wondering if it's like a normal kind of feeling that you have as an interviewer, because I didn't really realize that like maybe that's how other interviewers feel, like they want you to get there, they want you to ask questions. Is that like how you typically feel, like at least in the beginning of an interview?
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm the eternal optimist when it comes to interviews. Interviewing takes time and it takes effort, right? By the time you've brought a candidate on site, you think, hey, this person has a good chance of being successful. You want to like, I want to hire that person. I don't want to do more interviews. I don't want to interview 100 people for a role. If I can interview one person and they're a great fit, fantastic, hire that person. So almost always, everyone that we have interviewed, I can't think of any interviews we've gone into where that's not a person that we started the day wanting to hire. You want that person to be successful. You want them to get the solution. You want them to be a good fit. Now, the challenge of that is everyone's got to walk away from that interview and have an objective discussion about, is this the person that we want to hire? And sometimes you get people who, great personality, super easy to talk to, like really, really awesome to work with in the interview. Not great at problem solving, didn't have good solutions. And it's like, man, this is a bummer because this person was great to interview, like really, really nice. But at the end of the day, we have to be objective. In the same vein, if we're being objective and we have two candidates who are of roughly equal technical proficiency, and one of them was a breeze to work with, and one of them was like pulling teeth, there is a clear winner in this discussion, right? That's the person who interviewed well and was really easy to work with and talk to. So I would say I've not yet had anyone on our team interviewing anyone or interviewed anyone that I didn't want to hire and want to be successful in that process. It's always a letdown when they're not. She's like, it's such high hopes. But
thank you. Yeah, it's definitely given me a different kind of like frame of mind, thinking about like how to approach an interview. Now that I don't think they're trying to just like stump me.
Yeah, no, now here's the deal. You might get interviewed, and this is where there are people who interview well and people who do not. Most often they do not interview well because they are given no interview training. You're not at your job and people are like, let's talk about how we interview. No, almost always it's like, hey, we need some people to interview for this team. You're on the team. And so that's where you might run into engineers who aren't really interested in interviewing, who all they want to do is ask you a hard question and feel better about themselves. That might happen. That is a terrible interview and should be the exception, right? But also, again, like you're chalking up data points, right? How much does this company care about the people they're interviewing and the people they're hiring? Like if they're just throwing bodies at the problem and not adequately preparing them to interview, this is information for you, right? Like that's all. You're compiling your list of information as well. As an engineering team, we have our whole team interview. When we have people who have not interviewed before, we have them sit in on interviews and just observe. And the goal of that is, like, we want you to learn that this is a collaborative process. We want you to learn how we talk to candidates, how we engage them, how we try to assess the things we're trying to assess before you do it yourself. Because as the interviewer, the first N times that you interview, you are super nervous about being the interviewer as well, right? Which is not something that generally comes across as someone who's interviewing. You're never like, wow, I bet the guy sitting across from me is really nervous too. But for people who don't interview regularly and have that experience, they're probably not feeling great about this either. And so, like that's, just be aware, like sometimes you get people who are bad at interviewing or people who are new at interviewing. And I think that is also where having that back and forth of communication, having good questions to ask them, like that's going to facilitate, one, you getting as much as you can out of that process, but also them being able to ascertain more about you.
I had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know if I can like put you in a scenario. So say you have two candidates. One was did very well in his technical challenging part of the interview. Did very well. Needed no help, no assistance. Seems like an all right personality as far as like like you getting to know the individual on like a more personal level. But then you have another candidate who didn't do well on the technical portion. Did okay, need a little bit of work, but just did not do very well like overall. But they have a great personality. You engage with them very well. Which candidate are you more willing to like work with as far as like like your personal choice?
So this is ridiculously nuanced. So a lot of it depends on what's the role we're hiring for. What level of support can we give this person? So let's say person B in your scenario, they didn't blow the technical interview out of the water. They struggled with some things, but they had a really good core understanding. And their last job, like, boom, that you look at the growth, like it looks like this is a person, like if we could bring them in and adequately support them, they could learn rapidly and close that technical gap and then accelerate past that, right? That's somebody that we would feel good about, assuming that's the assessment and we have the resources to dedicate to that person. So we have hired engineers who don't have much experience, but have that high growth, who didn't know any of the languages that we worked in. And the caveat with hiring them was, we need to effectively be able to take an engineer and dedicate the time to ramp them up and set them up to be successful. In the same vein, we've been in positions just from a work and commitment standpoint where we don't have the people to spare for that. And so in that instance, I can't hire somebody who needs that type of investment. It's not fair to them. So just throw them to the wolves and be like, well, you weren't successful, so not a good fit. So there's a lot of nuance to that answer. And it depends not only on the candidates, but the situation that we're in as an engineering time for the time we're hiring plus 3 months after the fact, potentially.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for coming that up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else?
Is Arrive hiring?
We are hiring right now, but we have a front-end engineering role and a back-end systems role, but they are for like mid-level engineers. So we need we're looking at like 4 years experience-ish. Now my hope is we finished our merger with Flash, and so through COVID we did not hire. Our industry got smashed, and so we had some contraction, which was unfortunate. So we are post-merger now. Things are opening back up, starting to hire again, and so our immediate needs are, at the moment, we need people who are familiar with the frameworks and technologies, who can step in and be like day one contributors. And again, this is where we've got to be honest about who we're hiring and what we expect. We've got to be honest with candidates, and we need them to be honest with us, right? Because the expectation is you can't say you're an expert in Rails and then come in and you're Googling basic Rails stuff, right? That's not going to work. We're not going to have a good fit. So we try to be pretty transparent about that throughout the interview process, just to make sure, again, we want to hire the right people and keep those people. We don't ever want to hire somebody and 6 months in, we're thinking, we made a bad mistake. Or the candidate's thinking, this is a terrible mistake. I've got to find something new. And so that's part of that back and forth and that question asking during this process, is to make sure we're all on the same page about, here's what we're looking for, here's our expectation of you, here's what we'll give you. Here's what, we expect back.
Well, we all just finished our group project, so you could say that we're pretty experienced now. So
I like it.
But you bring up a good question, though, right? In regards to hiring and how organizations look to junior level hires, and it does depend a little bit on their maturity and what they need in roles, right? So we have hired junior engineers in the past, and those that are getting it. And ultimately, it matters. Any junior or earlier in their career engineer just needs mentorship, right? They need mentorship, they need growth, they need the ability to take on smaller but more meaningful over time bits. And if an organization doesn't have that kind of work available and or the bandwidth to mentor, it makes it hard. But as you know, we're pretty passionate about it, right? And we're going to get back to it as well. We just got to get to a stronger team, and hopefully most organizations have that same thought process.
Josh, I had a question. What's something that you've seen in new hires, whether they're junior or not, that's made them stand out above others?
Good or bad?
Sorry, good.
So I think the hardest thing seemingly for people early in their career, and by early, I'm still talking like 4 or 5 years in, right? This is something that we've consistently had to teach and help people with, is tunnel vision is such a problem, right? And I don't mean tunnel vision around solutioning. I mean tunnel vision around like, I've got to work this story and do this thing, right? And in reality, everyone expects that thing to take X amount of time. Let's call it a day, 2 days. Too often, people start working on a solution and you hit day 1. It's supposed to be done. I'm almost there. Day 2, I'm almost there. Oh no, roadblocks. Day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. And they're just beating their head against the wall, trying to find a solution. Having the ability to take a step back and go, all right, this is supposed to be done in a day. I'm at a day. It's not done. I'm hitting some significant issues. Let me grab some more people to do 2 things. One, let's solve this problem collectively as a team. It's much easier to take more inputs and arrive at a better solution. Maybe we thought about solving the problem incorrectly. Maybe our approach is wrong. Maybe we ran into issues where we wanted to use TypeScript and we pulled a library in and it's not TypeScript valid. Now it's an invalid package and our work is 10x what we thought it was, right? This gives us the opportunity as an engineering team to go, should we solve a new problem instead of the one we predefined? It also, though, gives us the opportunity to think about the product we're building and say, man, this is way more work than we thought it was going to be. Should we still do this? Just because we said we were going to do it a week ago when we thought it would cost us $1, if it costs $100 now, do we still want to do it? That is a skill that takes a lot of time for people to learn. And it's something that saves so much time and effort that if you can learn to do this, it's so helpful to the team that you're on and the organization that you're working for. And it is, we've got engineers that, I probably shouldn't use people's names. We got a guy with us 6 years. He's a great engineer. He came with us 4 years experience. 2 years in, I had to sit him down. I was like, what are you doing? You're in day 7 of a 1-day story. He's like, well, I'm almost there. I was like, you got to speak up. And we had to talk through, like, when you speak up, what can we do as a team, right? Like, this isn't on you to succeed or fail, right? The reason we have teams and we have this infrastructure is so we succeed and fail as a team, right? Part of what your manager should be doing, assuming they have time and bandwidth, is keeping their ears open, right? Like, oh man, Jonathan said he's been working on this for 4 days now. This wasn't supposed to take 4 days. Maybe I should check in and see if I can help, right? See if he's run into something unexpected or scope has inflated because we thought about A and B, but not C, D, E, or F. That communication, that recognition of where am I versus where should I be and what do I have left? When should I raise the flag? When should I ask for help? If you're the guy who asks for help every day, that's not positive, right? There's a line there where when do you fight through, and when do you raise the flag to the group and say, hey, I need some help here. Let's pull this together and figure it out. That is a super useful skill to develop and kind of balance to find, because it's going to let you not get stuck on things that then ultimately derail the team potentially. So that's going to help you and your team, but it's also going to let you start to be involved in kind of that thought process around rethinking business decisions and rethinking product decisions and rethinking architecture and solution decisions, which is just good general experience. Not every organization has all of their engineers involved in that process. And so being a part of that process can be very, very helpful, right? As you get exposed to, here are how different people approach the same problem differently, different ways that they think about it, and different potential solutions that are evaluated. How do you evaluate those solutions, and how do you pick at those solutions and find the negatives, right? So that we can start to compare competing solutions. All of that you can jumpstart a bit by keeping that top level mindset, right? Like see the forest, like don't hone in on the tree, like see that forest and understand where you're at and speak up.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like my scenario is a little unique because I had 10 years development experience in the early 2000s. And then I did something completely different for the Air Force for another 10 years. And now I'm trying to come back to it. What advice could you give somebody in my shoes trying to figure out how to get back into software engineering roles?
What did you do in your 10 years in software development?
So I did Oracle database applications for the first 4 in C and Java. I did a bunch of scripting and process automation in my next job with Perl and Bash, and then some system engineering where building up the daemons.
Well, you got
Sorry, my space bar is acting up. So I just did a bunch of different things and kind of was like that jack of all trades in that second role mostly. And then I did a few projects randomly as I had time and bandwidth.
Yeah, so I think the valuable thing there is, so one, C and Java haven't gone anywhere. There are plenty of places, right? Usually people are using Java frameworks, right? But they didn't go anywhere. The other part of that I think is very useful and something that is useful to communicate throughout the interview process is that 10 years of experience teaches you a lot about architecture, solutioning, how to approach problems. And most likely, given you were working in C and Java, you're working on more robust applications. So a lot of the frameworks today, and something we had to address with our Rails developers was 500 is not acceptable. That means the application crashed. You can't just let it crash and say that's okay, right? So we had to do a bit of re-education around hey, if we're an enterprise software business, it cannot crash. You must handle your exceptions. They must be graceful. You must return meaningful error messages. Those are all really valuable lessons and valuable experience. And so that 10 years likely brought with it a good set of knowledge that can be applied to any technology, right? Whether let's say you go somewhere and they do Ruby, or you go somewhere and they do Python, the language is irrelevant in that context. That's where being able to speak to some of the growth during that time, some of those solutioning and architecture things that you might have done or you might have learned, that's helpful. the interesting bit is languages and familiarity, right? So
Sure.
Java today is different than Java 10 years ago. Like I did Java 10 years ago. I did C++ 10 years ago. They're very different today. And so if those are areas you want to get back into, like you should probably brush up on the Delta there, right? If you're targeting a new language, hey, you're like one of many people targeting that language, except you also have this background experience that can be highly relevant. And so communicating that throughout that interview process, like that's all value add, you know, like that's not necessarily a negative, because that's hard to come by. You don't read a book and get a lot of that experience. Like there are some things that, you know, just have to happen that you work through, that you start to learn like, oh, hey, these are issues that we see at scale or at really high volume that you don't see through normal programming or exercises or side projects. So I wouldn't downplay that, you know, speak to what you learned, speak to, you know, how that, you know, applies to what you'd like to do in the future. And, you know, then combine that with, you know, hey, I'm coming back into this. Here's what I've learned. Here's where I want to go. I think you should be in good shape.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other questions for our presenters? Definitely appreciate their time, but we could wrap up if there's no other last questions out there. Going once, twice. All right. Definitely appreciate Josh and James jumping in. Yeah, we definitely appreciate you guys sharing your knowledge and helping our students. Yeah, our students have mock interviews tomorrow, so hopefully the material you presented today goes a long way for their mock interviews tomorrow. Yeah, thanks again, Josh. James, again, we appreciate you. I know you said yesterday that you love presenting and doing this topic because you're passionate about recruiting and hiring. We equally love having you going through these career coaching sessions. So thanks a lot to both of you guys. Any parting words from either of you guys?
So I would say, don't be frustrated if you have a bad interview. You will have bad interviewers, and you may have a bad interview. That's okay. It's a somewhat flawed and challenging process. So stick with it. Yeah. It'll be fun eventually.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Thanks everyone for letting me be a part. Let Josh join in here. And seriously, like I am on Slack. Feel free to ping me if we're not connected on LinkedIn. Reach out on LinkedIn. I'll gladly help out any way I can. So don't be shy.
All right, awesome. Again, thank you guys so much. I think we definitely appreciate it. I'm sure all the students do. But thanks again for sharing your knowledge. And yeah, we'd love to see you guys in the next cohort if possible. Right. Otherwise, yeah, thanks again. And then November students, again, good luck with your group projects, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Hey guys.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks.